Tonight we turn our attention to housing. I'm going to make just a few sort of historical comments at the outset before we kick off our guest speakers, starting with Jerry Anthony. Just to set this sort of very broad historical background and sort of tie this into some of the other things we've been talking about. Housing policy in the U.S. comes largely after much urban and residential development. And so there are concerns about tenement housing, about safety and welfare and patterns of land use in American cities, you know, very early on in the 19th century, but there's no authority to do anything about it. In fact, there's the zoning authority, the ability of cities to zone is not really settled by the Supreme Court until 1926. And so what you get is a fairly chaotic pattern of residential development, shaped not only by private markets, but also pretty extensively in the American context by private forms of discrimination, both through the practices of the real estate industry and also through formal instruments like restrictive deed covenants, which, depending on what part of the country you were in, often specified whether, you know, African Americans or Chinese were even allowed to buy property in specific neighborhoods. So here's an example from my own research showing the reach of these covenants, restricting the ability to buy property in the city of St. Louis. It's the Mississippi on the far side there. The first sort of substantial federal housing policies come, as with so many other things we've been talking about, in the New Deal era, and really consist of the sort of first push for public housing, which is, you know, both an effort to meet the needs of people who are, you know, on their back because of the Depression, but also, as is the case with much federal policy, as an aid to the construction industry as well, as a way of stimulating the economy. Alongside this sort of early development of public housing, the New Deal sees the introduction of the Federal Housing Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, introducing the modern mortgage, right? That prior to the FHA, you bought a house, you had to put 50% down and pay it off in 5 years. The FHA stretches that out, creates the low down payment, the federal insurance for the mortgage, and a secondary market by which lenders can sell mortgage securities. But again, the FHA went into cities, here again is St. Louis, and rated neighborhoods as to where they would lend or where they would insure mortgages and where they would not. And often those ratings, again, were starkly racial in their logic. So the FHA was reluctant to lend in the yellow and red areas, much more reluctant to insure, rather, in the green and blue, which were the suburban developments outside the city of St. Louis. This first blush of federal policy is, in a sense, really interrupted by World War II, which brings the New Deal to a grinding halt and changes all the priorities. And what you get in the context of the war is very rapid and often haphazard federal housing built in the vicinity of army camps and defense installations, new factories on the outskirts of Detroit, in the shipyards on the West Coast. Often very haphazard development in some respects, or in some senses, public housing, sometimes temporary housing, and sometimes, as you can see in the case from Vancouver, Washington, echoing the sort of suburban development that would be much more familiar in the post-war period. But this, too, was a period that was sort of starkly racial in its development. There was a riot in July in Detroit in 1943, largely stemming from issues over housing, over whether black Americans could move into certain neighborhoods, over whether public housing projects built in the city of Detroit would be open to African Americans. The end of the war brought the first substantial National Housing Act, 1949, and then revised in 1954. 1949 lays the groundwork for more elaborate public housing. 1954 adds to that the ability of cities to engage in urban renewal, to actually tear down substandard areas of the city, slum clearance, and put up something in their place. But the importance of these acts was that they reflected a substantial compromise between Northerners and Southerners in Congress over issues of discrimination and open housing, but also between the real estate lobby and public housing advocates. And the deal that's struck is that there's no discrimination or anti-discrimination rules put in the federal housing program. So the early public housing programs are built on an explicitly segregated basis. And then the compromise between the realtors and the public housing advocates creates a circumstance in which for any unit of public housing you're building, you have to tear down a unit of substandard housing. So despite a housing shortage, the public housing program is not adding units to the nation's housing supply. And this yields over time the sort of famous or infamous big box public housing, Pruitt-Eagle in St. Louis and Cabrini Green in Chicago as examples, going up for the most part in the late to mid 1950s. It took some time for municipalities to assemble the land and the funding they needed to proceed from the Housing Acts of 49 and 54. But again, this is at a time when the substantial policy instrument, the FHA subsidies for mortgages, are really pushing development to the outskirts of the city. So here you can see in concentric rings outside of St. Louis, first a wave of subdivision, then incorporation, then zoning, almost exclusively single family, and as you move away from the city, larger and larger lots. And this again is sustained by local, again, we're moving from federal to local regulation enabled by state law, zoning of land use, which establishes for these entire municipalities, these postage stamp municipalities outside St. Louis, what they can and cannot build. And it was the rule particularly in the middle years of the 20th century in many of these municipalities, you could not build any multifamily housing, any commercial housing, or have any industrial districts. That loosened over time, but it contributes to this pattern of residential sprawl sort of into the cornfields outside St. Louis and cities like it, and at the same time decline in the city center. The next major federal initiative is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which finally disallows the use of instruments like restrictive deed covenants. They'd been partially disallowed in 1947, but it's not until 1968 that discrimination in private housing transactions is illegal under federal law. And following from this, there's an effort to rethink public housing. People recognize that the sort of big box model failed, largely because these were seen as quite explicitly by their designers as ways of warehousing inner city populations to clear the area where they'd lived for urban renewal, for sports stadiums and convention centers and that sort of thing. But Pruitt-Eagle is the first to be torn down. The Chicago projects come later, and public housing shifts to other programs which provide mortgage assistance or vouchers for rental, what we now call Section 8. But what's remarkable about this is the sort of patterns that emerged in many American cities. Now, our guests will speak particularly to the Iowa example. I just wanted to touch on a sort of larger metropolitan example to give you a sense of what all of these policies fitting together meant for the development of cities. So let's look again at the city of St. Louis. In this series of maps, I'm showing you the movement in and out of the city of African Americans and whites, 99% of the population of St. Louis over this period. And so you can see during the war years, between 1940 and 1950, African American migration into the city, but hemmed in by those restrictive deed covenants, they move into only particular tracts right downtown. We move ahead 10 years. Now we begin to see the orange is the clearance of people for urban renewal. They're moving west in the city, but all of the new white migration is into the outer suburbs. And the same pattern occurs as we move ahead in time, 60 to 70, 70 to 80, 80 to 90, and 90 to 2000. What's remarkable about this story is the population of the city of St. Louis, which is 900,000 in 1950, is now barely 300,000. The city just depopulates over time in this sort of sprawling pattern. And what we see in big metro settings like St. Louis is not only this extensive sprawl of suburban development, but an emptying out of white and eventually black population in the inner city. So here's a large neighborhood in St. Louis bounded by these 4 streets, and you can see how densely built it is. This is a fire insurance map from 1930. If we go to 2000, these are the properties that are abandoned in that neighborhood, and this is true across much of the north side of St. Louis and, of course, cities like Detroit in more recent years. So I think, the important things are keep in mind, the importance of that New Deal moment and how things spin away from that in the period after, how, because federal policy hinges on that New Deal moment, how deeply racialized it is across the entire 20th century. And also in the case of housing, and our guests will speak to that, the sort of tangle of jurisdictional authority with different federal, state, and local responsibilities governing the way in which housing is paid for, the way in which the building is regulated, the way in which land is zoned, and the way in which land is used. So with that, we'll turn to our first guest, Jerry. Pete's going to do, where did Pete go? The introductions, and I'll get the presentation set up.